They saw the sort of success that the right had with critical race theory, with CRT, and transforming this acronym that very few people knew what it meant into this culture war issue. They saw another three-letter acronym, ESG, and so they wanted to do the same thing.
Hello, this is Amira Hassan.
And I'm Waleed Shahid.
And you're listening to Bloc Party, a show about progressive policies, about progressive lawmakers, but one that I'm constantly trying to turn into a pop culture podcast. Am I succeeding? Am I winning? Not yet, but we'll get there. And you heard him. He's back. Waleed.
I'm back.
Shahid is back on the mic. He disappeared for a minute. He went on vacation, went to Costa Rica, was hanging out with the sloths. How you doing? You better be doing good.
I'm tanned. Can you tell? No? You're just brown.
It's
I'm a
Zoom,
darker shade of brown. I'm good. I got to see sloths in trees. They look mostly like hairy fur balls. It's very difficult to see them. We went to a really pro-animal, pro-environment, very liberal, progressive sloth sanctuary. And they told me...
We love to hear it.
They told me that there are other sloth sanctuaries where they do horrible things to the sloths, like bring them down from the trees and hand them to the guests and visitors, and that they don't do that at this one because they protect nature and animals and blah, blah. And I was like, Emily, you brought me to the wrong place. I want to go to the Disney...
We're canceling.
I want to go to the Disney World version. I want to hold a sloth. That's what I thought we were going to do.
Well, he's back on the mic and ready to get canceled. This is why you don't give men mics, I think. This is why. Anyways, on today's episode, we're not talking about sloths, Costa Rica, or pop culture. We are going to talk about the anti-ESG movement.
Amira, what made you interested in this topic with this obscure acronym that I don't really even know what it stands for? Like, I'm like, when you were like, we're doing an episode about ESG, and I was like the salt they put in Chinese food?
It's because I have ESG or something.
You have ESG?
He does not get my reference, damn. And flatlining.
Is it Mean Girls?
Jokes flatlining.
It's Mean Girls, isn't
yes.
it? Oh, I got it. Yeah.
Hey!
Oh,
wow, I had no faith in you. I had zero faith.
I know. You're canceled now. Okay, well, tell us why we're talking about this. What made you interested in this?
Well, we're talking about it because I've been down the Republican rabbit hole for a minute now. And if you remember that first episode we did way back in the day, we talked about the Conservative Partnership Institute and all the stuff they've been up to. And one of their projects has been to cut the woke out of government. And with the budgetary fight in Congress, I've been following that really closely. And that led me to this offshoot of this, because the right is all they are doing is talking about cutting the woke out of society currently. But you probably more likely have heard about the anti-critical race theory movement. Mm-hmm. And from the creators of anti-CRT comes the next banger, anti-ESG. And that led me to really dive into this. And also 2024, baby, Ron DeSantis, the Republican presidential primaries, all of this is currently a very hot topic. What do you think ESG stands for, if you had to take a guess?
Equity, social justice, and government.
I mean, that's a solid guess. Almost there. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And ESG is this concept broadly refers to investing strategies that prioritize environmental, social, and governance factors. And ESG has been around as a concept since 2006, so it's not new. But this anti-ESG push is relatively more recent, and it's been really bubbling up at the state level. And the right is saying that these investment firms are no longer working in the best interest of the people that they're supposed to serve, and they're no longer doing what is the most important thing, which is anything and everything to maximize your profits, right? They are saying that BlackRock and these other wealth management firms are actually dilly-dallying with your money and playing social justice warriors, quote unquote, by taking money out of investments that could be lucrative but are not good for the planet. Or they're, saying that they care too much about the makeup of a boardroom, right? They're saying, oh, well, why should investment firms care about how many women and how many people of color are part of this boardroom? They are going beyond the scope of their actual work. And that in turn is screwing people out of money. Let me define asset management firms. Asset management firms invest pooled funds from clients through different investments such as stocks, bonds, real estate, some of the biggest clients being various government pension funds. And these firms make decisions relating to where, when, and how much to invest your assets, right?
Amira, I don't have any assets.
That's why I'm describing what asset management funds are, because I know you and I don't have assets to manage.
I have my laptop. Is that an asset?
Only if you go to the pawn shop.
BlackRock's like a very large pawn shop. Got it.
Yes, exactly. BlackRock is an asset management firm, and they happen to be the world's largest asset management firm. They're the big dogs, and they happen to have been champions of ESG. Okay. And Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, and he's currently been the target of this right-wing anti-ESG movement. They've decided to make him really the face and the name, and BlackRock the poster children of everything that is wrong with woke investments. We're going to tell you more about BlackRock in the actual interview, but that's all you need to know for now. Okay, you know this next character, Ron DeSantis. This one is a freebie.
I do know Ron DeSantis. He's a great friend of mine.
A great friend of
sanctimonious
Waleed's.
baby.
Governor of Florida, presidential hopeful, Trump disciple turned into Trump nemesis. He's been on this anti-ESG kicker. Recently published a book where he dedicates several chapters on this. And then you have this other presidential hopeful, one that you probably don't know. Do you know Vivek Ramaswamy?
Of course. I'm South Asian. We all know each other.
Shut up. Okay, well, he is the author of Woke Inc., and he's the co-founder of the Strive Asset Management, and he's been also all in on telling people the evils of woke asset management, which is honestly an oxymoron, but here we are. And then one other player that people should know about before we jump into the episode is the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And there are, similarly to all these right-wing foundations, their official mission is to promote and defend liberty, personal responsibility, that's an important one, and free enterprise in Texas and the nation by educating and affecting policymakers in Texas and beyond. Do you want to guess who funds them?
Big oil.
How did you know? Stop. You do have ESPN. You're psychic. You got that.
It's usually Big Oil.
Yeah, and the Cook brothers, State Farm Insurance, Big Tobacco, some of their biggest funders.
State Farm. I didn't expect that one. State Farm is not on your side. Is that their jingle?
Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Fuck. That was the wrong jingle.
So anyways, just a quick glossary of people that we're going to be discussing with our guest. So while I got to pretend to be the expert for a second, we actually did talk to a real expert to give you guys the lowdown on all things anti-ESG. Today on the podcast, I get to interview climate journalist and author Kate Aronoff. Her book is right here, right there. Overheated: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. And let's go learn, Waleed. Let's go learn about ESG.
Love it.
And I'll catch you all in the outro where we process what we learned. I am so thankful and so excited to be chatting with Kate Aronoff today. And she's going to help us make more sense of all of the right-wing outrage about ESG. I first started to really dive into this topic because of all of this cutting woke out of the federal government and the budget, and that quickly led me down the path of discovering this anti-ESG movement, which ESG is about the private sector and private investment, but it has really become a hot political topic on the right. And so I read your piece in the New Republic. The right has it in for woke investors. The only problem, they don't exist. And one of my takeaways from your article is that there's just a big show going on between our main characters, BlackRock, some random guy Vivek, and these anti-ESG politicians. And they're putting on this big show, but we want to unmask their real motivations. At the top of the show, I gave a quick glossary of some of these terms and some of these people, but I really want to hear from you. What does ESG actually mean? And then what does it mean for the right? Because those are two separate things.
Well, thank you in advance for going through the sort of glossary of terms that I feel like whenever I write about this, I have to redefine. So thank you for taking that labor away from me for this show. So ESG is really in the eye of the beholder, and it's even strange to talk about it as a noun. It stands for environmental, social governance. And that can mean any number of things. So traditionally what that means is sort of a set of standards which investors will use to determine the impact that a stock or a company or a product will have on the world, or to assess the impact the world will have on a stock or a company or a product. So it can mean something like sustainable investment. So if a company decides to buy a bunch of solar panels, for instance, or to change the way that they power their facilities, that can change their ESG score, which I'll talk about in a second. There is no standard definition, really, of ESG. It has always been the sort of umbrella term, and that traditionally has been a very convenient marketing tool for a lot of companies who would like to say that they're doing better by these metrics, whether that's on climate or diversity and inclusion or any sort of governance or labor practices. They will say, we love ESG, we care about ESG, and there is no real standard setting for what that is. And so an ESG score, which is also a sort of umbrella category, will be determined by kind of third-party actors who will come in and assess or, act as consultants essentially to say, this company gets an A or a B or a C. There's all these sort of private metric makers who will stamp something onto a company, and that is supposed to be judged by investors. So it means nothing and everything. And I think what we'll probably talk a little bit about is that for a while it has been like largely marketing on behalf of the private sector. And now what's happening is the right is taking all those claims largely to do with the sort of environmental portion of that at face value and saying all of this good marketing you've been doing, we actually, disingenuously of course, but we think that this is what you're actually doing, when in reality that's not what's happening.
And one of the biggest folks that the right has identified as being too woke is BlackRock. And I know you've done a good amount of writing and research on BlackRock. In 2020, you wrote an article posing the question, is BlackRock the new vampire squid? And do you have an answer?
I don't know if I've come up with an answer yet. I think they have vampire squid characteristics, if I were to say, which is a little more complicated now that the right has started talking about them as they have. But BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager. So there are three big asset managers. So basically people who handle the investments of pension funds, for instance, retirees, any sort of institutional investors will have money in BlackRock, and their job essentially is to take a chunk of cash and is given to them by people, retail investors or institutions, institutional investors, and invest that in a way that can make money. And so it's a very concentrated industry. So BlackRock is the biggest of three major asset managers. So Vanguard and State Street,
they're at the top.
Are the top, the big three as they're known. And they've really sort of blown up since the financial crisis. And that's sort of a wonky story, but I'll try to say just briefly that before, big institutional investors who really just want sort of steady returns, they don't want these big risky products. They don't want to be doing kind of big short style faluting trading. They just want to put their money somewhere, make sure it will grow. Those investors traditionally sort of flock toward safe things like U.S. Treasury bonds when interest rates were cut after the great financial crisis. Those became less steady investments. They were not a good source of yields anymore. And what companies like BlackRock had to offer were these passive index funds, right, which are managed by algorithm. They offer very low fees, management fees, and so are a pretty good place to put your money in there, contain sort of wide swath of investments linked to standard indexes like the S&P 500, for instance, that are just sort of a big picture basically of what is happening in the economy, so you're not overexposed to any one particular industry. So those things were very attractive, and so what that's allowed BlackRock and companies offering similar things to do is just to take on a tremendous amount of assets under management, and that is what they've done. So BlackRock now, as I said, has something on the order of $10 trillion worth of investments, assets under management. And what the right and the left both talk about is that they have sort of a lot of control in a legal sense, whether they exercise it or not, over corporations. So the big three asset managers own, on average, 20% of the average S&P 500 firm, which is a lot, right? There are, if you look at sort of big corporations, if you look at who the top shareholders are, often it will be BlackRock or a Vanguard or a State Street or Fidelity, these big asset managers who just have a lot of capital. And so they put it in these places. But I think part of what is going on with the right's criticism of BlackRock is just sort of bog standard anti-Semitism. It's very easy to point to. It's playing in a lot of anti-Semitic tropes, is what I'll say. Point to one guy, happens to be Jewish, who is controlling the strings of global governance and exerting his influence on these corporations to pursue this woke agenda. And so you see that sort of style of argument come up in a lot of the criticism of BlackRock. And we can talk about what BlackRock is actually doing, which is not woke at all, of course, but that tends to be behind a lot of how the right tends to talk about BlackRock in particular, which again is one of a number of asset managers who do have a lot of say over what corporations are doing.
Yeah, I will say that initially reading about this, I came upon this anti-ESG movement and I would have had no reference point about BlackRock, and you walk away feeling like, okay, anti-ESG movement bad, BlackRock good, hero villain, these are the binaries. And it's like, okay, is the enemy of my enemy my friend now? And you're like, no. So let's talk about what BlackRock actually is doing.
Yeah, it's part of what broke my brain for so long about this story and why I was grateful to get to just sit down and write. Like, I filed, I think, 7,000 words about this. It's because I am a climate reporter and for a long time have looked at the sort of financial sector's relationship to climate change, and in particular, financing by asset managers and big banks of the fossil fuel industry. And all of these asset managers who the right is now accusing of divesting from energy companies are continuing just to pour millions and billions of dollars into fossil fuels, right? And so I think the thing that's important to understand about BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and all these companies is that they are capitalistic firms, right? They have one sole mission, and that is to make money. And that the way that they make money is to recruit more fee-paying customers, right? That is their entire business model, right? Is we want to attract as many customers as possible who will pay us as much money as possible to manage their investments. And that gives them a different relationship to corporate returns than corporations, right, who are focused on making as much profit in their business as they can. And the business model of fossil fuel companies, for instance, is very different, right, than that of a BlackRock or a State Street or a Vanguard, because they are concerned about fossil fuel returns, where BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, they care about returns insofar as it helps them retain and attract customers. But the actual sort of quarter-to-quarter returns are a lot less meaningful to them, and they are exposed to the entirety of the economy. So if fossil fuels are doing worse, that's a little bit immaterial so long as their products, right, these exchange-traded funds, these passive index products, are continuing to generate returns that keep their customers happy and make more people want to put their assets with them. And so I think that is part of this conflict, which there are many other elements to it, but there are no real good guys in the story, right? Because we're not really rooting for BlackRock, right? We're not rooting for Larry Fink or people who are continuing to plow money into the fossil fuel industry. And we're not rooting certainly for these very reactionary, anti-democratic Republicans who are trying to do sort of heinous things with state pension funds. So unfortunately, it's the type of story where you don't really come out rooting for anyone.
Well, there's no heroes, there's no villains, but yeah, I mean, if I'm sitting here lefty, I'm like, okay, well, why should I care about this anti-ESG movement? Like, why does it matter? It's a little bit sounds like a snake eating its own. It sounds like a circular firing squad that may be good, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to bring up, right? Because I like it when forces that the left, of which I would put myself broadly in the camp of, is people at the left are fighting each other. That can be very productive and helpful if they're sort of taking each other down. I think the thing that's concerning about the anti-ESG movement is just how much it reflects a lot of recent developments on the part of the right, and just how sort of overtly anti-democratic this process is. And so to just dig in a little bit to what these bills looked like, most of this effort has been coming from the state level. So the American Legislative Exchange Council, of course, famously funded by Koch Industries and the remaining Koch brother, has put forward a bunch of model legislation that has really proliferated out, mostly through red states. And what that does is there's a couple of different pieces of legislation. The sort of one that has caught on the most in state capitals has been so-called anti-energy discrimination elimination acts, which really rolls off the tongue. And those sort of instruct state fiduciaries, so comptrollers or state treasurers, to draw up a list of companies that are deemed to be boycotting energy companies. So financial firms in particular, so your BlackRocks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, any sort of big financial institution. And then they put them on a blacklist. They send them a letter and say, you're doing this thing we don't like. If you don't stop doing, we're going to stop doing business with you, and then take their money out, right? And that is a pretty broad range. Some states have taken just a little bit of money out. Some states are moving towards sort of cutting off more significant contracts. But where that hits is people like my mom, right? Who, thankfully, she lives in New Jersey, so has not been subject to this, but has a public pension fund, right? Was a teacher for 30 years, and part of this industry, this asset management industry being so complicated, is that these companies do offer competitive returns. And so if you swear off doing business with the companies who are, the main actors who are investing pensions, then you're threatening returns from those pensions and by extension, sort of threatening the livelihoods potentially of a lot of retired teachers and firefighters, et cetera, who depend on these returns in order to continue to sustain their livelihoods, there has not been a sort of catastrophic effect of this yet, right? We haven't seen that, but you have seen concerning signs from places like Texas, where studies have found that when Texas decided that it wasn't going to do business with BlackRock and other big companies that, aside from investing pensions, underwrite bonds, right? Underwrite the sort of things that can fund new water systems, that can fund school gyms and public projects like that, they left. And so public entities like schools or city governments were forced to go to much less competitive underwriters. So are paying just millions and millions of dollars more in fees to companies. And if you're talking at the scale of a city government or a school, that can really add up. They don't have a ton of excess capital to sort of play around with. They can't, in some cases, raise money themselves through things like taxes. And so that is sort of threatening just as basic public goods when state governments start doing this.
It's wild that reactionaries will actively harm folks. It's very on brand for messaging to create a boogeyman, to radicalize the base and get people feeling like they're victims of this anti-Semitic trope and all of the others who have coming and somehow profiting more than you are. So while it's taken its time to make its way to the federal level and federal conversation, this has been something that's been going on and bubbling up from the states for quite some time. And as all terrible things seemingly have been starting, this is a story that starts in Texas. which has been one of the, I think, premier grounds for a lot of different balloon trials. And a lot of this has been being pushed by the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is also another Cook Foundation, oil, gas, fossil fuel money, all the usual actors providing their funding. And they've been cranking out these bills and these laws and have lots of folks who answer to them in the state legislature and the governor's mansion. And they have this ad called Life Powered Navajo Nation. And we're going to play it for you because
I am familiar.
yeah.
From my window, I can see a castle with 3 chimneys.
The natural resources that we've been blessed with, and in particular coal, has been today and has in the past couple of decades been an important fabric, not only directly for the Navajo Nation, but regionally for the entire state of Arizona. Many of the policymakers nationally that are pushing for increased regulations on carbon and increased regulations on a coal economy really don't understand many of the families on the Navajo Nation.
It's the off-brand like Avatar soundtrack is really what gets me. among other things, but that really it's.
Well, I was going to ask you what your first reaction was when you first saw that video.
I mean, it's really just like the fossil fuel industry has done this sort of thing forever, right? In that it's just divide and conquer, right? They want to pit people who should be on the same side of each other, right, against one another. And so they find a sort of convenient narrative. I don't want to say that there aren't many people in the Navajo Nation who are excited about coal power and want that to continue. But the fact that this ad is being funded by fossil fuel companies who have absolutely no interest, right, in either that land, in the sort of livelihoods of people in the Navajo Nation, right, is just so cynical and disgusting. And to fuel this just totally nefarious campaign to essentially criminalize doing things to protect pension fund assets, right? You have to like really work your way through this sort of leaps and bounds to get to a place where this makes sense in any kind of world. And it's just so deeply, deeply cynical to weaponize Indigenous people against climate change, right? Against climate policy and climate campaigners. And yeah, it's so cynical and also distressing how much of a budget they have to make these sorts of videos, right? That's probably an expensive video. And they just have a sort of unlimited tap from whoever's funding them, which they've refused to tell me multiple times. But we can guess the realm of usual players who are pouring money into this.
Yeah, that's one thing that stood out to me. And I was going to ask you, do you think this is an effective ad? How do you think it comes across? And then I was like, they don't ever have to really worry about it. They have the money to burn. It doesn't have to be effective. It doesn't have to really accomplish what it doesn't have to do anything because they could just make a bunch of these.
Yeah, there's no scarcity, right? They also made, which I found in a really depressing rabbit hole I went down of looking at the Texas Public Policy Foundation's YouTube page, a mini series about the Battle of the Alamo, which, yeah, it's like a dramatic Yellowstone style telling of the Battle of the Alamo, which somebody is signing checks for them to have the money to do that and promote it.
Lord. One thing that I kept asking myself is like, why is this all a thing now? Like, why is ESG as a concept has been around for a while. And I know there was a little movement against it during the Trump years. He had that regulation change at the Department of Labor, I think, at one point, but none of it bubbled up to being this thing that it is now. And I know that 2024 is around the corner. Obviously, there's been anti-critical race theory, anti-trans bills, cutting the woke out of government, the budgetary fight that we're in and is ongoing. And it's clearly a political playbook, but I genuinely am just so confused at the timing. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
There's a lot of questions about this campaign. So I think, as someone who's been covering climate politics for a long time, there has never been a point when there's been a public conversation about climate change when it has not been a culture war issue, right? Like it is since the early 90s and George H.W. Bush talking about the spotted owl and these crazy people who want to defend wildlife. That has always been the ground on which climate and environmental issues are talked about. And so I think the best that I could tell from looking at this for the last several months is that they saw the sort of success that the right had with critical race theory, with CRT, and transforming this acronym that very few people knew what it meant into this culture war issue that managed to galvanize a lot of people in scarily a lot of somewhat grassroots way, people turning up to school board meetings, etc. They saw that success, and they saw another three-letter acronym, ESG, and so they wanted to do the same thing. But that, I don't think, totally covers what is happening, right? Because you look at this campaign, it's very confusing to work out who it's for. Fossil fuel companies themselves, if you look at any sort of public statement by Exxon or Chevron or any of the big oil companies, they all talk about ESG, right? They all promote their diversity and inclusion. They all talk about their commitment to climate change. There is some of that money coming into this fight in some ways, but they are not the sort of leading drivers of this stuff. And the banks hate it, right? So this is against a sort of other big arm of capital. Both, obviously, asset managers are opposed to this, but also even you see local banking associations really coming out and opposing these state level measures because it's restricting their ability to do business, right? It's telling them things they can't do, which business traditionally doesn't like. So as best I can work out, and if you look at sort of who is funding these efforts, you can find links to people like Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, right? These very hardline, ideological, I think libertarians is maybe the wrong word because they're not really so committed to any kind of free market value, but people who want to destroy the administrative state, right? And so what we saw the Supreme Court do in the West Virginia versus EPA ruling last year was to invite all these challenges to the administrative state to say, if you want to make an argument that a federal agency is overstepping its bound, we would like you to do that, is essentially what John Roberts' opinion said. And so there is now an opportunity to do that in the courts with such a strong conservative majority. And so what you've seen Republicans doing recently at the federal level is taking this momentum that's been built in the states and channeling that into these things that are going to work their way up into Supreme Court challenges. So just yesterday, Republicans passed a resolution that they will not be able to enforce, will get struck down, but to challenge a Department of Labor rule put out by the Biden administration that just allows for pension funds to consider ESG. There will be a big fight, and already is a big fight, around Security and Exchange Commission rules requiring companies to report their fossil fuel emissions across their supply chains and their operations to the SEC in the way that they already report various other kinds of material risks. So I think my theory of this, and you can read the article and take that up, but my theory of why this is happening is that they want to destroy the administrative state, and marshaling these sorts of challenges to ESG and the federal rulings that are coming out around it, which reflect a certain zeitgeist within the financial sector to assess climate risk for very material reasons, is a convenient path to do that. So I think that's the main prize, right? They want to destroy the administrative state. They want to keep agencies from being able to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a way they can marshal momentum to do that.
So the House voted on a resolution to block a Labor Department rule allowing retirement plan managers to include ESG in their investment plans. And it also went to the Senate. And before the House vote, there was definitely a bit of worry that we were going to have a ton more Democratic defectors who would join Republicans because, as all things, this culture war, bad faith, reactionary political argument does happen to work on our friends, Democrats. And I guess I shouldn't have been worried about that because one constituency Democrats will definitely stand up for in the culture wars are going to be wealth management firms because they are rich corporate stakeholders. There's always a chance that a few Democrats get spooked enough by enough pressure that they would fall into this trap and say, oh yeah, maybe
And Joe Manchin joined
Maybe we
it.
should.
Yeah, Joe
Oh
Manchin
yeah,
joined
no,
this
of course.
challenge.
And he's fighting the good fight in the Senate continuously,
Our
being a
boy.
brave voice. Our friend of the pod, Joe Manchin. And I mean, for the most part, it was a party line vote in the House, but Golden did vote with Republicans on the resolution, and I was really worried. But then I thought about it, and I was like, oh, why was I worried? BlackRock is down with. They've been very close to the Biden administration, and Biden even came out before this with this resolution and said he would veto it if it were to pass the Senate. So I guess I shouldn't have been as worried as with when they put up resolutions condemning socialism.
Yeah, I think that the bigger danger is the courts. I'm not personally so worried, especially in the next 2 years, that there will be legislation passed that limits ESG along the lines that Republicans are pushing for. I could be wrong, but I think the courts definitely, sometime in the next several years, will probably make a very scary ruling along one of these challenges to an ESG regulation.
SCOTUS.
Friends of the pod.
We're also friends of the pod, yes. We didn't talk about Vivek very much, but I know he's a player. He's a long shot presidential hopeful, but he has a book, anti-woke book,
Woke Inc.
Woke Inc. Yes, there's so many versions of the same thing. I'm like, Ron, Vivek, you guys got to change up the brand. You're running in the same lane. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about him?
Yeah, I spent a long time, unfortunately, watching YouTube videos and podcasts with Vivek Ramaswamy for this story, and I think you're right. Like, I don't think Vivek's presidential campaign really has legs. Somebody likened it to Tom Steyer's Democratic primary campaign in 2020, which is it's somewhere between like a Tom Steyer and a Andrew Yang, who voiced his support for Ramaswamy 2024. But I think
they seem energetically aligned. That makes sense.
Yeah. Similar kind of vibe. I think the reason it's interesting to talk about him is just the part of why this anti-ESG story encapsulates so much about the modern right and its relationship to climate politics as just the pure grifting element of it, right? So Vivek Ramaswamy runs an asset management firm that for a while was going by the code name of Whitestone because it is looking to be an alternative to BlackRock. And so he's gone around the country giving speeches for a lot of money, talking about Woke Inc., his book, and also meeting with Republican state legislatures, with pension boards, with state treasurers and fiduciaries, and kind of pitching his services, right? So both for states to invest pension funds with Strive to some extent, but more so what they've managed to make a little bit of leeway in is getting them to create proxy advisory contracts, so advising pension boards on how to vote with the shares they have in corporations through their pension funds. And it's a grift, right? That's all it is, right? It's just, there's all this talk about sort of like high-minded ideals. He has all these lines like confronting climatism and wokeism and these secular religions or whatever. He says the same like 6 things in every single interview. He's just trying to make a buck. Like he's just a grifter. And that is how that should be understood. I think that's how the presidential run should be understood. I think that's how, most of what he's done can be talked about, which is not unique, right? We're living in a golden age of scammers, but I think he, is among them.
Work ain't honest, but it pays the bills,
Oh yeah. And I love a grifter. I love a scammer. I love to support scammers, but not this one.
You're like more like the Anna Delveys.
Yeah. We can really get behind some of them, just not this guy.
Okay, just to wrap us up, because we do like to give people some action, some ways to like, what can the left do? What are some solutions here? How should we orientate our actions? I'm a journalist. You figure that part out. I'm just telling you.
I think it's just part of why I wanted to write the story and why I've been interested in reporting it is I do think these things are like intentionally sort of hard to grasp, and that's part of why it's such a ripe terrain for the right, like CRT is that there's very little sort of understanding of what these things mean. And so even just being clear about the terms of this debate and who the players are, I think can go a long way. So don't find yourself tempted to go volunteer for BlackRock or something as a charitable organization. Go. They don't need you. They don't deserve your support. But yeah, go volunteer on a JD campaign and try to. And I think part of what the story also can emphasize is just the importance of these sort of local fights. There's plenty of political scientists who have written a lot about this kind of playbook, right, of starting at the local level because you can jumpstart campaigns with not that much money. They're easier places to sort of seed policy. And so I think this really underlies the importance of those lower level unsexy offices, like state treasurer's offices, right, and state assembly and senate seats. Those are places where a lot of these playbooks are being really workshopped. And so I think if I have this sort of like positive takeaway, it's to really look sort of up and down the ballot and not sort of write off these offices that can seem very unsexy, like treasurers and fiduciaries, because they are really actively being politicized by the right, and that is new. That they're started, I think, most famously with Attorneys General and the Republican Attorneys General Association, who is supporting this anti-ESG stuff. But the State Financial Officers Foundation is looking to do the same thing, and I think there's no reason why that wouldn't extend to other quote-unquote unsexy offices. So yeah, local stuff matters, state stuff matters in particular. And so just a sort of word to be unfortunately, have to be paying attention to all this stuff, because the right is definitely paying a lot of attention to this stuff and pouring a lot of money into doing very bad things.
I have nothing to add.
Great, we solved it.
Period.
We did it.
We did it, Joe. Thank you so much for joining us on the pod. Really appreciate you taking the time to break it all down to us. And people, go buy Overheated, because if you thought all of this anti-ESG stuff is bonkers, wait till you get into the whole history.
There's a lot more where that came from. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure to talk about some of the worst people on the planet.
All right, Wally.
What's up?
Time to process our feelings, our thoughts. I know Kate gave us her take on this, but I would love yours. What do you see as the Republicans' goal in all of this, with this obscure movement?
Yeah, I really resonated with what you all were talking about in terms of how this is similar to CRT, where the goal of the anti-CRT movement is explicitly, it has nothing to do with the curriculum, but more about demonizing public schools and public education and teachers' unions. And CRT is like the Trojan horse in which they can do that. And so for the anti-ESG stuff, what Kate was saying at the end, where this is essentially a Trojan horse to have no checks from government or in any way on the oil industry or on many other industries. And so yeah, I mean, it's scary because it's like deliberately designed to, one, fearmonger amongst the Republican base about what ESG is, and also two, make it really difficult to understand what's actually happening. And so I like that Kate has made it her mission to clarify what all this means and make it a little more digestible. Hedge funds, asset managers, private equity, ESG, woke capitalism. Yeah, it's a lot of jargon.
It is, and I agree. And I agree with her assessment that this is the ultimate goal, is to attack the administrative state. But I will also say something about timing, about this like really becoming a thing now. Just like we saw the anti-CRT movement as really born out of a direct response to the 2020 uprisings and calls to address structural racism and the public conversation about what it means to be anti-racist. Folks behind the anti-critical race theory movement specifically came out against all of these things, and they dubbed all things that are to do with racial justice as critical race theory. And because most people weren't familiar with what it is, because it isn't something that is just out here, it's like a legal theory. They got to strip it of all of its original meaning and have it be this like signifier for all things woke. And they're doing the same thing with ESG. And I will say on the timing with ESG, I think it's also a direct response to the IRA and these climate investments passing and what they see as an overreach as always in government. And I really do think that it is like picking up steam because they see the successes of what this climate movement has been able to do in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I think that is correct. And it's a way for them to be able to undermine the IRA on the state level, like you're saying, too, because most of this is happening in state legislatures.
So, Waleed, we played this ad by the Texas Public Policy Foundation for Kate, and I had to, I have to call you in and ask you your thoughts as the comms professional, as a very senior Democratic strategist. Was that a good ad? Was it effective?
It doesn't have that many views on YouTube, so I'm sure where it's being served. But it was a very, very high production. Like it was like 4K breaking my laptop. Like, why is this? When I was listening to this, I was like, I could totally imagine them playing this at in Secession in the last season where they gather all the for Investor Day or whatever, and just like imagining while upstairs there's something crazy happening.
Just like Succession, where they got us rooting for the private equity bros.
Yeah. ESG is like Shiv's thing in the show.
Yeah, it is.
I don't know. They have a lot of money. I mean, it's like a classic story about a marginalized community, working class people being picked on and exploited by oppressive big government in Washington and being protected by the company in the company town, in small town America. And yeah, I mean, this is part of the woke capitalism DeSantis thing, which is like that the actual enemy is like bureaucrats in Washington who are out of touch with your community. But that's kind of been the conservative playbook for decades. So yeah, I don't know. I do think that the transition away from fossil fuels, stuff like this is going to be way more apparent if like the IRA is not delivering concretely. I don't think it's like an easy thing for the economy to shift in a lot of these places unless people feel it and see it.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that I will always get stuck on is the fact that the right doesn't really have to ever think about how effective something is from the ad to just even like taking on BlackRock, the largest investment management firm. And they're like, yes, they are our enemy. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't even have to work in the short term because they have so much money to spend on these like schemes and strategy, and the left doesn't, even if their nonsense eventually pays off. But it is able to because they have so much money to spend on nonsense, and we don't.
I mean, the other thing when Kate was talking about anti-Semitism and the critique of BlackRock from Republicans, we've talked a lot on this show about fascism in the Republican Party, and like historically fascism has always had a critique of the banks and like but like it's not an anti-capitalist critique. It's just we should run the banks for the businesses that support us, which in this case is big oil. And so I don't know, it's interesting to me that there might be more Republicans talking about capitalism in 2024 than Democrats for that purpose, because they know that it's a way to exploit people's fears about being left behind in the economy. But didn't Biden say at the State of the Union something? Capitalism without competition is exploitation. Joe Biden. Or Karl Marx. Let's look it up, folks. I think one thing that we're seeing is like an alignment of these asset managers and things, hedge funds and blah, 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 BlackRock, etc., that seem to be aligning more with the Democratic Party for various reasons. And then you have big oil getting entrenched in the Republican Party. And these are both forces out there that want to make money, and like they are competing with each other to make more money. And so it's important to see how that develops, because there's a problem of big business's influence in both parties. And yeah, it's not a great development. Well, once again, we end on the downer that is late stage capitalism, Amira.
Our in-house Aquarius, keeping it real.
How's the Kazi Livy going? Next time, we'll discuss the Kazi Livy.
An obscure reference, perfect, on brand. The end. That's our show. Thank you so much, Waleed, for coming back, for rejoining the gang on the pod. And thank you so much, Kate Aronoff, for coming on and breaking it all down to us. I learned a lot. Waleed learned a lot. And we hope you learned a lot too.
No sloths were harmed in the producing of this podcast.